welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. Today, we're going to be talking about Armored Sentinels, and I will admit I have been a bit inspired to talk about these based on some of the recent success that they have seen in competitive play. That said, over my small number of games, I do want to start off by saying that this unit falls a little bit outside of my comfort zone. Not necessarily because I think it's a bad unit, but because I think it doesn't really fit my playstyle. However, in an effort to make sure that I can give all of you guys the most valuable information possible, that means I gotta talk about units that I don't play very often. I've been trying to play them a little bit in my practice games recently, and I found that a lot of synergies that I talk about in this guide are difficult for me to adjust to, and so I don't necessarily expect a lot of players to have success with this right away. That said, if you want to see the list that I was inspired by, make sure you check out the link below in the description for the Ko-fi, where you can find the list from Scott Cairns and all kinds of other lists as well. It's pay whatever you want, but anything is appreciated. But of course, you can get it for free. Also, I want to give a big thank you because recently we hit 500 subscribers on the YouTube channel. That happened sometime in the last week, depending on exactly when I actually upload this. But I want to thank all of you guys for sticking with it so far. We're about 2/3 of the way to the total watch hours needed to unlock memberships. And when that happens, I will be opening up a members-only Discord channel. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully, we'll be hitting that in August, September. So today, as usual, we're going to be talking about the Armored Sentinel basics, how you can equip your Armored Sentinels, Born Soldiers, and why it's kind of overrated. We'll compare this unit to Bullgryn because they fulfill similar roles on the tabletop. Then we're going to talk about Ursula Creed and a lot of combos that you can do with this character in particular. And then we'll close out by talking about orders and stratagems, and then general strategy you're going to be using when you look at these units. So to start off, Armored Sentinel basics, and you might hear me call them Hat Sentinels throughout the course of this video. That'll definitely be a bit of a slip because the way that I first started playing Armored Sentinels and put them on the tabletop, at least in the recent editions, is I would put them there and then I would tell my opponents the ones with the hats are the Armored Sentinels. And he was like, "What are you talking about? All of your guys are either wearing hats or I can't see the guy." And I was like, "Oh yeah," and then took the top off, and because it just kind of fits there, I was like, "Look, it's a hat." So these are the Hat Sentinels. Anyway, Armored Sentinels are mostly mid-board control and move blockers. You will be plopping them towards the middle of the board, and you're going to take up a lot of space. However, for their points, Armored Sentinels don't deal a lot of damage, especially once they've already fired their Hunter-Killer missiles. They're mostly just really durable bodies. However, Armored Sentinels also make great use of the fact that they have the Regiment keyword, and that means that they have a ton of synergies with the rest of the index, in particular Ursula Creed, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. Now, when you're going to be playing your Armored Sentinels, there's a couple things you will always be bringing. Firstly, you're going to be bringing a Sentinel Chainsaw and Hunter Killer Missile because they are free upgrades. We used to have to pay for these, we don't anymore. However, your main gun does have some choices. Scott Cairns, who I did an interview with recently, brought 3 plasma cannons, and I'll throw up a link somewhere along the top where you can take a look at our discussion on how he actually was using them. However, Sean Pewterbow also went 5-1 with autocannons on his Armored Sentinels. I know some of the people who are actually bringing these are toying with the idea of bringing las cannons, and they're probably still good, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. And heavy flamers are probably okay if you're playing in very heavy horde metas. However, they probably do the least damage to all relevant targets of all the weapons you can bring. Also, do not consider the missile launcher. It is not good, and unless it gets a buff, you just never bring missile launchers ever. Unless you're trying to play something that looks cool, because I will admit it looks really sick. But it doesn't look as cool as the plasma cannon, so ultimately, that's not even a good argument. Anyway, everyone on the June 24 data slate who has played Armored Sentinels and done well has brought a unit of 3. So that is Scott Cairns and Sean Pewterbow. However, on the April 24 data slate, we did see some scattered Armored Sentinels being brought, such as Richard Coatsart, who took 3 units of 1. I don't know exactly what the thought process was there, because I haven't had a chance to talk to him, but the reinforcements value is one of the major things that you generally value when you bring this unit. However, you can consider bringing units of 2, because if you have a unit of 2 and you lose 1 Sentinel, the other one never has to take a battle shock test because it is never below half strength. It is at half strength. In general, I would err on the side of bringing a 3rd Armored Sentinel, but if you're just looking to fill some points, 2 of them is reasonable. Now, to continue the discussion on what weapon you want to be bringing, it's going to depend a lot on what you're trying to do with the Armored Sentinels. As you can see here, the plasma cannons are, by a decent margin, the best into Guardsmen, Marines, and Terminators, and most things where it's going to be benefiting from Blast. However, it's not as good at shooting much more heavily armored targets. The las cannons, on the flip side, are by far the best when shooting at vehicles and monsters, but because it's such a low volume of shots, it's not going to be doing basically anything into low value targets like guardsmen and marines. However, if you want something in the middle, you can look at autocannons. In general, I would argue that plasma cannons or las cannons should be what you're going to be looking at. Simply because plasma cannons and las cannons are significantly better at the things that they are good at shooting, whereas autocannons are nowhere near as good at doing either of the jobs. They are somewhere in the middle instead, but as you can take a look, like at the Rhino, a las cannon will do 8 wounds, and autocannons will do 5.7, but that's not that much more than plasma cannons. And then conversely, if you look at plasma cannons, they will do so much more damage to guardsmen, whereas autocannons, yes, they'll do almost twice as much as las cannons, but still, at the end of the day, if you're killing 3 guardsmen, you don't care. So ultimately, when you're deciding how you want to equip your Armored Sentinels, you gotta figure out what your army is missing. If you need the ability to shoot at infantry, it's always plasma cannons. If you need more anti-tank, it's the las cannons. If you're kind of balanced around the entire army, you can consider the autocannons. Okay, now, I was seeing a lot of hype on Reddit and Discord about Born Soldiers and the way that it has changed. On the June 24 data slate, regiment units get lethal hits into non-vehicle, non-monster units, and squadron units get lethal hits into vehicle and monster units. Now, luckily, Sentinels have both the regiment and the squadron keyword, so they get lethal hits every single time they go for a shooting attack. I've seen a lot of people get very hyped about this. This is the 9th edition Born Soldiers that we got with the Codex, which was very strong. However, who cares? I know I got a comment last time about how I was, my sassiness or my snarkiness was kind of getting in the way of potentially understanding whether or not I was joking. And this is definitely one of those times where I'm not joking. Like, lethal hits doesn't matter. As a quick shorthand when you're actually thinking about lethal hits, it's approximately equal to +1 to wound. It's not as good as +1 to wound when you're shooting at really tough targets, and it's a little bit better than +1 to wound when you would already be wounding on a 2 or 3 anyway. However, it's pretty close, and if you do that as mental math, you're going to get a good enough answer if you're just trying to figure it out on the fly. So what this means then is that lethal hits is more valuable with lower strength and high volume weapons. Because Armored Sentinels are bringing plasma cannons, las cannons, or autocannons, they are all fairly low volume, high strength weapons already. And since you're rerolling wounds into vehicles and monsters, the +1 to wound is not quite as good as we were expecting in all of these. And ultimately, none of the weapons that Armored Sentinels are equipped with really care about these lethal hits. Like, they make a bit of a difference, but as we'll see on the next slide, it's ultimately not that much. And here's some of the actual math that you need to be thinking about. Now, all of this was calculated at unitcrunch.com. Big shout out to UnitCrunch. They don't sponsor me or anything. The website is just awesome, and you can use it a lot to figure out how much extra damage you do. But here is a more specific understanding of how much extra damage lethal hits will do for you. Lethal hits, as opposed to not having it, will kill less than 1 extra infantry unit every time you shoot. And then, into most vehicles, it's worth approximately 1 extra damage on average. Now, of course, it's not going to be, you're not going to be doing 5 damage with a plasma cannon. You're going to be doing 4 or 6, but it doesn't even round you up to where you're more likely to be doing the 6 than doing the 4, right? Even though you see, like, into a Rhino, it's 4.5 with lethal hits and 3.7 without lethal hits, that difference is still going to round to 4 in a vast majority of the times that you shoot. So ultimately, if the reason that you're trying to look at Armored Sentinels is because of the Born Soldiers change, you're wrong. Unless your argument was that Armored Sentinels were just slightly too bad without the increase in damage, then maybe. But that is a very narrow band of how strong you thought Armored Sentinels were before. All this said, Armored Sentinels did get a lot better on the June 24 data slate, but it has nothing to do with the Born Soldiers change. Instead, it has all to do with the fact that they have the regiment keyword, and regiment got better. But it wasn't a change to Armored Sentinels directly that made Armored Sentinels better. And I realize now that I put things in the wrong order earlier. However, I'm not going to change it, and I'm going to deal with that. The change that made Armored Sentinels better was a change not even to Ursula Creed specifically, but to how abilities like Ursula Creed's works. Before the June 24 data slate, the free stratagems coming from Ursula Creed were limited to things that had the battle tactic tag. This was pretty much just Fields of Fire. However, now that we can do it on everything, and Ursula Creed allows a regiment unit to use his stratagem within 12 inches for -1 CP, there are some really good stratagems that you can use on the Armored Sentinel. Firstly, Smokescreen, which normally costs 1 CP and is not a particularly good stratagem, or rather, it's not a particularly effective use of RCP, is now free. Armored Might, which is not very good on our tanks, but is rather good on the Armored Sentinels, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is now 1 CP. Tank Shock is now free. Heroic Intervention, which also went from 2 CP to a 1 CP stratagem, you can also now do for free. And so suddenly, if you have Ursula Creed within 12 inches of these Armored Sentinels, they get a lot of extra utility just kind of across the datasheet. Additionally, Ursula Creed is something that a lot of people are still trying to decide whether or not they want to be bringing. However, you can have Creed lead a Khazarkan or a battle line, particularly a Cadian or an infantry squad, or just be solo nearby. And then, in general, Khazarkan can give themselves an order, and Creed can give the Khazarkan another order, which means that Creed, if used in this way, just has an extra order that she's not using. Why not give those to Sentinels? On a similar note, this isn't on the slide, but a lot of people are already bringing a Lord Solar unit with a platoon command squad, an infantry squad, or a Catachan squad, in order to allow him to give orders at 24 inches. But a lot of the time, the order from the platoon command squad is just going to their own unit. You're going to make a mortar shoot a little bit better. Doesn't really matter. So one of the highest value things that you can give that regiment order to is to the Armored Sentinels. It's worth noting that there's not a lot of other targets. You can't give the regiment order to Bullgryn. You can't give the regiment order to tanks. And so this is one of the ways that you can effectively make use of an order that you're already paying for. Now, one of the questions I have seen raised is on the June 24 data slate, there is a blurb about measuring to destroyed models and measuring to destroyed units. This raises the question once again, is if we can use the reinforcement stratagem for 1 CP from Ursula Creed on Armored Sentinels that were just destroyed. Most TOs will rule that you cannot do this. However, just as I mentioned in the Lehman Russ video, there are going to be a couple who will. So, if this is something you're interested in pursuing, make sure you ask your TO before you actually build your list and before you get to the event. Now, with all that said, I do want to spend a couple moments comparing Armored Sentinels to Bullgryn. And Bullgryn are a unit that almost every top player is already bringing. Both Scott Cairns and Scott Peterbout, who were bringing Armored Sentinels, were also bringing Bullgryn. So let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages that you have with both of these. Starting with Bullgryn, Bullgryn can walk through walls because they have the infantry keyword, whereas Armored Sentinels, which are vehicles, cannot. Bullgryn have the grenade stratagem because they have the grenade keyword. This means that they can chuck a grenade and do 3 or 4 mortal wounds to a target every time in the shooting phase, whereas Armored Sentinels cannot. Bullgryn have invulnerable saves, which makes them more durable versus AP3 or greater shooting, regardless of whether or not they're in cover. Things like Lascannons and Melta weapons are not as effective against Bullgryn as they are against Armored Sentinels. Bullgryn will also win their melee fights. Even though Bullgryn will slowly win their melee fights, they will win them, whereas Armored Sentinels' melee is so poor that they will never really win fights against anything but the lightest and worst melee units. However, there are benefits to Armored Sentinels. Armored Sentinels, because of the regiment keyword, can receive regiment orders and stratagems. We already talked about characters like Ursula Creed and the Platoon Command Squad give out regiment orders. Armored Sentinels can use these, whereas Bullgryn cannot. And regiment orders are easy to come by, whereas Bullgryn can only be ordered by Lord Solar. Armored Sentinels also come back with the reinforcement stratagem. This is probably one of the major reasons to actually use Armored Sentinels, because they are a very valuable reinforcements target. Armored Sentinels also have a 2+ save. This means that they are more durable versus anything that's AP2 or less, simply because they'll be getting a 2 or 3+ save against all of these small arms fire, whereas Bullgryn are going to get chipped away by that very effectively. Armored Sentinels also have shooting. This means that if they aren't getting into melee, they can still present some threat, especially to things like Marines and Guardsmen, with their long-range shooting. However, some of the major reasons that they are both important to think about is they're both very durable. They're both very tough, they both have good save, and they just have a lot of wounds to punch through. Bullgryn are toughness 6, 3 wounds apiece, -1 damage, and a 4-up invul save. Armored Sentinels are toughness 8, 7 wounds apiece, and a 2+ save, and have access to some really good defensive stratagems. At the end of the day, they are similarly durable. Not exactly, but they're going to take a similar amount of time for most of our opponents to remove. They're both relatively fast moving. Bullgryn, with their ability to walk through walls, are a little bit more mobile in some ways. However, Armored Sentinels move 8 inches base and can move 11 inches if given the move order, which, if you just need to go in a straight line, that is farther from Armored Sentinels than you can get from Bullgryn. They're both going to be playing for center board control. Both of them are quite good at sitting at the no man's land objective in the middle of the board. This is really important, especially if you're playing on Pariah Nexus terrain layouts, because a lot of the center objectives are just left completely in the open. Lastly, they both have a fairly similar cost. On the June 24 data slate, Bullgryn cost 180. This might go up in the future, whereas Armored Sentinels are currently costing 195 for a unit of 3, and this might go down in the future. Ultimately, they're fairly similar in their price, so that's probably not the make or break reason why you would bring one or the other. As we start talking about orders and stratagems, it's not quite as straightforward as some of the other units that we have in our index. By default, you're likely to give Armored Sentinels take aim most of the time. I'd say in a little more than half of your turns, you're going to be giving Armored Sentinels take aim, simply because it improves their shooting damage output. And most importantly, on the turn that you fire your Hunter-Killers, you're going to want to give them take aim, just because it makes them 33% more likely to even do damage at all. But that's the easy one. Move is one of the strongest orders that we have in the Guard Index. Armored Sentinels, even though they have poor melee, they are great move blockers, and the ability to move quite a bit, up to 11 inches with move, and up to 17 inches with a 6-inch advance, they care a lot about where they actually are on the board. Move allows you to do a lot of things and gives you really important breakpoints in order to move into good positions, take objectives, and control space on the board. Duty and Honor is another one that you will oftentimes find yourself giving Armored Sentinels. Maybe I'd say like once a game a lot of the time, sometimes more than that. But it's important to think about the fact that Armored Sentinels are OC2. And if you have 3 of them on objective, you have OC6, which is a really nice breakpoint, because a lot of full health units are 5-man units that are OC1, and this means that we can out-OC them just by standing on the objective. And there's a lot of ways where we can stand to entirely prevent our opponents from even standing on the objective at all. In contrast, going to OC3 for a total of OC9 isn't nearly as likely to be an important breakpoint. In general, because a full health unit that is 10 models in OC1 still has 1 more OC. However, if we still want to look at that OC6, 2 models in the objective, that's a really nice breakpoint to put on an objective as well. And sometimes you put Duty and Honor on Armored Sentinels just to help out the rest of the units that might also be on the same objective. In general, if giving Duty and Honor would score you VP or deny your opponent VP, it's usually worth doing. It's also important to remember that Duty and Honor is not just +1 OC, it is also +1 leadership. Really important to try and prevent battle shock on your units, because it means that you can continue to use stratagems on them. The other ones are kind of bad. Fixed bayonets, you don't do a lot of damage anyway, so it doesn't change much. Take cover does literally nothing for you, since you already have a 2+ save, and you cannot improve beyond a 3+ save with take cover. And first ring fire, second ring fire does nothing for you, because we don't have access to any rapid fire weapons, so you basically never give these last 3 orders. Now, the stratagems are where the Armored Sentinels really make their value come in. So Smokescreen, if you've watched a lot of the other officer training school videos, I'm a pretty big believer that Smokescreen is kind of bad. However, if it's free, it doesn't matter if it's bad, because it is still a durability increase that we otherwise wouldn't have. It's more valuable on Sentinels because of the concept of the survivability onion. I might do a video on this later on, but the first idea is can't die if you're never seen. However, if you are seen, you can't die if you're never hit. If you are hit, you can't die if you're never wounded. Even if you're wounded, you can't die if you make your saves. Now, if we compare this to Leman Russes are way better at not being wounded because they're toughness 11, whereas Sentinels are only toughness 8. And so, we can't really affect our ability to be wounded, but we can affect our ability to be hit. And by making that tougher, our lower toughness doesn't matter as much. Similar way, Armored Might is conditionally really good at 1 CP. It is important to remember that Armored Might is shooting phase only. You cannot use it during the melee phase. But just as we talked about with the toughness and Smokescreen, it also applies to Armored Might. Something else to think about is the way that breakpoints work. Because Armored Sentinels have 7 wounds, that's a really inconvenient breakpoint for a lot of weapons. As a brief thought experiment, let's imagine that you're getting shot at with a 3 damage weapon. Normally, you would have to fail 3 saves for that 3 damage weapon to kill an Armored Sentinel. However, if you're -1 damage and now they're doing 2 damage, you would have to fail 4 saves. That's a 33% durability increase. If you're getting shot up by a damage 4 weapon and you have -1 damage, you go from needing to fail 2 saves to needing to fail 3 saves. That's a 50% durability increase. So if you can do that for 1 CP against anything that's damage 2, 3, or 4, it is going to get a lot of value. Now, switching to offense for a little bit, Heroic Intervention is a really important stratagem to understand. If a unit near you gets charged that is within 6 inches, for 1 CP, you can declare a Heroic Intervention, which means that you get to roll a charge against the opponent that just charged you. This can have a ton of strong effects, and one of the major things that you'll see is when people will charge other units, they will not have everything in base to base right away. So, if you use Heroic Intervention and rush in with Toughness 8 2+ save bodies, if you can get in base to base with all of these models, then all of those models are now hitting something that's very durable, whereas they wanted to hit something else. And it's important to note that the only reason why we're able to use Heroic Intervention with our Armored Sentinels is because they have the Walker keyword. There's honestly an entire video to be done about Heroic Intervention, but the one other thing I'll note is this is a great way to get more models onto an objective. And then if you have Duty and Honor, suddenly they're going to be on that objective during your next command phase, which can help score a lot more points. The last one that you really need to look at is Tank Shock. Now, especially with the changes to Tank Shock, Armored Sentinels are usually not the best user of this, simply because they're going to be doing less damage on average than a Lehman Russ or a Rogel Thorn. However, they can do it for free. 3 mortal wounds is a lot better than no mortal wounds. Reinforcements is one of the best targets for this once per game stratagem, especially on the June 24 data slate, where Rough Riders have lost some movement due to the pivot rules. So in general, if you are going to be bringing Armored Sentinels, this is probably the default unit that you want to use the stratagem on, simply because it is a very high value unit. Now that said, default does not mean only. If you are playing battle line units and you want to play for a secret mission, you can still use reinforcements on those. If you're playing Khazarkin or Rough Riders in the same list, you can still use it on those. However, by default, this should probably be the unit that you're planning to use the reinforcement strat on. Lastly, Fields of Fire. Because Armored Sentinels have the regiment keyword, you can use it for 1 CP on them. There's usually something better that you can have Creed point to and use the strat for 1 CP on, but sometimes you don't. So this is something that you can use on Armored Sentinels, and because most of their weapons have high AP anyway, they don't really miss the not getting the bonus AP from benefiting from the stratagem. Wow, I think this was the longest I might have ever spent on the Orders and Stratagem section. Cool. Let's talk about some basic strategy on how you actually want to play Armored Sentinels. In a similar way to how we played with our battle line on the April 24 data slate and our Khazarkin, make sure that you get your Sentinels killed so that you can revive them. While Sentinels are really tough and very durable, and a lot of armies will struggle to bring them down in melee, strong opponents will, 1, try and ignore your Armored Sentinels after they fire the Hunter-Killer missiles, and 2, they will also try and leave you with 1 model alive because 1 Armored Sentinel is going to do no damage and is just going to be annoying on the board. However, we have a lot of tools to try and get our Armored Sentinels killed. The main thing that you can do is you can charge into the enemy. One of the important distinctions of 10th edition as opposed to 9th edition is any model that is in melee must swing. You do not have a choice to not swing. And so if you put your Armored Sentinels into units that can kill the Armored Sentinel, they have to hit you back. Just make sure you're not battle shocked when you do this. And if they don't kill you, then great. You have an Armored Sentinel that's in a really annoying position and preventing your opponent from moving the way they want to and shooting the way they want to. A major reason why you want to get your Armored Sentinels killed is because they play for opening salvos. Now, on turn 1 or 2, when you first shoot your Hunter-Killers and all your guns at whatever targets you want to, Hunter-Killers effectively double your shooting damage output for 1 shooting phase. Now, normally, if you do this on turn 1 or 2, you kind of got 2 shooting phases out of the Armored Sentinels, 1. Until you get them killed, and they get their Hunter-Killer missiles back, they're not going to do a lot of damage. So, you're going to try and get them killed in order to get another opening salvo later on. Most of the time, you're going to be trying to move your Armored Sentinels directly into the center of the board. They're going to be one of the units that are going to be fighting for the objective in no man's land. Toughness 8, 2+ save, it's a pretty tough profile for a lot of armies to chew through. But something that a lot of strong players will do is they will also move Armored Sentinels, especially against melee armies, into positions where your opponent will be left wide in the open after their charge. So if they kill the Armored Sentinels, or even if they don't and we fall back, we can shoot at these targets on our next turn. Lastly, as we've talked about many times, a lot of the benefit from Armored Sentinels on the June 24 data slate is not actually based on how the Armored Sentinels got better. Rather, they benefited from a different change of having Ursula Creed close by. The stratagem range of 12 inches and an order range of 6 inches, if you have Ursula Creed hiding in a ruin right behind your Armored Sentinels, well, it's going to be hard to get to Ursula Creed for a lot of these melee armies, and 2, you're going to make the Armored Sentinels way more durable, way more damaging, and overall just way more effective. For this video, I want to give a massive shout out in particular to Scott Cairns, who contributed very heavily to this guide. In a similar way to how Paul Clifton kind of taught me how to play Rough Riders, Scott Cairns has taught me a lot about how to play Armored Sentinels. So again, recommend going to check out the interview I did with him. Other major contributors to this guide have been David Purcell and Nick Jagiello. So thanks as always for all of these players who are contributing to these guides. We're going to be continuing to put out these tactical debriefs in the officer training schools, and I have another interesting video idea that I'm going to be experimenting with later this week, so I'm looking forward to how you guys all think about it. All that said, thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in so far and is still here. My name has been Joshua Joushi Howard. This has been Officer Training School, and we've just gotten done talking about Armored Sentinels. So, we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.